Well, he had a lot of rhythm. He was a very good singer, and he was.
Near the end of his life, Johnny Cash finally talked about Elvis Presley. He had refused to speak before. When he spoke, his words were deep and unexpected, and the world had no choice but to listen. What did the man in black reveal about the king of rock and roll? Join us as we explore the words of a legend. The early days. When we talk about Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley, two of the greatest musical figures of all time, their stories don't start on big stages or in front of roaring crowds. Instead, their journeys begin in a small rented building on Union Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. This place was called Sun Records, and it was here that songs that reshaped American music were first captured on tape. Sun Records did not start as a famous recording studio. It was the creation of a restless, passionate man named Sam Phillips. He opened the Memphis recording service in 1950 with a bold slogan: "We record anything, anywhere, anytime." Instead of screening artists based on polish or perfection, Phillips cared about feel, emotions, and authenticity. He was interested in music that felt alive and untamed, the voices and rhythms of everyday life that came from the Deep South's gospel, blues, and country traditions. In those early years, anyone could walk in with a few dollars and cut a record. That openness meant incredible talent walked through the studio's doors. One of those talents was Elvis Presley. In 1953, an 18-year-old Elvis walked into Sun Records to record a homemade acetate. It was a simple keepsake for his mother, and a first glimpse to the star he would become. Though the business was still figuring itself out, the spark in Elvis's voice caught Sam Phillips's attention, and a few months later, he was recording what would become one of his first big breaks. His fiery, soulful version of That's All Right mixed blues, gospel, and the one tree in a way no one had heard before, and it lit a blaze under the burgeoning music scene. Not long after this happened, another young singer was knocking on Sun's door. Johnny Cash was a lanky young man from Arkansas with a deep voice and a sharp songwriting talent, had already written songs in Germany while serving in the United States Air Force, and now wanted to turn music into a career. Memphis was where he settled after his service, and he went after his shot with determination. After repeated visits and persistence, Sam Phillips finally gave him a chance, and Cash began recording with his band, the Tennessee Two. Early Sun singles like Cry, 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 and Hey Porter began to turn heads, but it was the release of I Walk the Line that catapulted him into stardom, crossing over from country charts into the general music consciousness. So, by 1956, Sun Records had become a hive of musical creativity. Artists like Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis were bringing their own fresh sounds, while Elvis and Johnny Cash were gaining steam as rising stars. On an ordinary December day, something remarkable happened that would echo throughout music history. On December 4, 1956, Carl Perkins was in the studio recording new material. Sam Phillips had invited Jerry Lee Lewis, then still fairly unknown, to play piano on Perkins' session. As the day went on, Elvis Presley, already a huge star, stopped by the studio with his girlfriend, curious to see what was going on. He listened, chatted with Phillips, and eventually stepped into the studio. Not too long after, Johnny Cash showed up as well, according to his own recollection, wanting to hear the Perkins session. This casual visit turned into something bigger. With a tape rolling and no formal plan, the musicians began to play. First some gospel, then blues, country, and random favorites. It was spontaneous, relaxed, and entirely unplanned, what you'd call a jam session. Sun's engineer, Jack Clement, realized what was happening and kept the tape running. A few hours of music, laughter, and rough harmonies were captured, though not initially released as a commercial record. The next day, a local newspaper, the Memphis Press Scimitar, ran a photo of Perkins, Presley, Lewis, and Cash gathered around a piano. The article dubbed them the $1 Million Quartet, a name that would become legendary.
I'll never forget it. Elvis drove up out there in a white Continental Lincoln Mark II, 57 model.
That moment was more than just a photo and a few minutes of music. It was a powerful symbol of connection between artists who were changing American music in real time. Each artist brought something unique. Elvis, with his electrifying blend of styles. Cash had a deep, resolute voice and songwriting craft. Perkins came with his rockabilly guitar work, and Lewis had his wild piano flair. Together, in that small Memphis studio, they created a spontaneous snapshot of a musical revolution in progress. Though the session wasn't commercially released until decades later, its impact on how we remember the roots of rock, country, and rhythm and blues cannot be overstated. In that informal gathering on that fateful day, Union Avenue became the birthplace of legends. Now, let's shine the spotlight on our two stars and the bond they shared. When the crowd wasn't watching. When Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley first crossed paths in the mid-1950s, they were not celebrities yet. They were just young men navigating the same uncertain industry, moving through the same southern circuits, and recording under the same Memphis roof. Their relationship in that decade was shaped less by rivalry and more by shared beginnings, professional respect, and the strange speed at which success arrived. By 1955 and 1956, Elvis Presley had become Sun Records' breakout phenomenon. After the release of That's All Right and subsequent regional hits, his move to RCA Records in late 1955 launched him into national stardom. Television appearances followed. Crowds grew larger and the hysteria surrounding his name intensified. Meanwhile, Johnny Cash was still building momentum. His deep baritone and stripped-down sound stood in contrast to Elvis's explosive stage presence. But both artists were rising within overlapping audiences.
The best performer, probably Elvis Presley. I don't think anybody could touch him.
They were often booked on the same touring circuits, including package shows across the South. During these early tours, musicians spent long hours traveling together in cars and buses, sharing modest hotels, and performing multiple short sets in a single night. Cash later recalled that in those days, Elvis was friendly, polite, and grounded despite the sudden fame. Accounts from fellow musicians describe Presley as generous backstage, quick to laugh, and deeply respectful of other performers. Cash couldn't agree with them more. Their connection was strengthened by common influences. Both men were shaped by gospel music from childhood. Both grew up in modest Southern households. Both loved country radio and rhythm and blues records. They understood the cultural line they were walking at a time when music was still heavily segregated by race and format. That shared musical language created an unspoken bond. Even if their personalities differed, their roots were similar. However, their careers quickly began to diverge in structure and scale. Elvis's contract with RCA brought major national promotion, high-budget recordings, and aggressive management under Colonel Tom Parker. His television appearances on national programs placed him in millions of American living rooms. The screaming audiences and controversial media attention elevated him beyond the regional fame he once shared with other Sun artists. Johnny Cash's rise was steadier and more grounded in the country market. Songs like Folsom Prison Blues and I Walk the Line established him as a distinctive voice in country music, with crossover appeal, but without the same level of pop frenzy that surrounded Elvis. Cash toured constantly, often performing in smaller venues and building loyalty through repetition rather than spectacle. Despite these different trajectories, there is no strong historical evidence of bitterness between them during the 1950s. Cash did not frame Elvis's rapid ascent as betrayal or abandonment of Sun Records. Instead, he seemed to understand that Presley's move to a larger label was part of ambition and opportunity. In later interviews, and in his autobiography Man in Black, Cash described Elvis during that early period as clear-minded and aware of the business around him. Their interactions were professional but cordial. They were not inseparable companions, yet they were far from strangers. They appeared together on touring bills and shared backstage space. Cash understood Presley's magnetism, and Presley respected Cash's songwriting strength. Each recognized the other's authenticity. That mutual recognition mattered in a music scene that was evolving quickly and often chaotically. The cultural environment of the mid-1950s also shaped their relationship. Rock and roll was still controversial. Religious leaders criticized it. Parents worried about it. Radio stations debated whether to play it. In that climate, artists who blended gospel, blues, and country were under scrutiny. Cash and Presley were both navigating that tension. Each maintained public ties to faith while performing music that older generations sometimes considered rebellious. This shared balancing act created quiet understanding between them. As Elvis's fame accelerated into national obsession, practical distance began to grow. Security tightened around Presley. His schedule became dominated by national tours, television appearances, and later film commitments. Cash remained intensely focused on songwriting and live performance, carving out his own lane within country and emerging Americana traditions. Their worlds overlapped less frequently. Still, in recounting the 1950s, Cash did not portray Elvis as lost or corrupted during those early years. Instead, he spoke of him as sharp and aware before Hollywood pressures and isolation altered Presley's daily life. Cash's recollections suggest that the real shift came later, not during the initial Sun Records era. Another important detail is that both men were competitive by nature, but not openly antagonistic. The music industry thrived on chart positions and ticket sales, yet there is little credible documentation of direct rivalry between them in that decade. If anything, they benefited from each other's visibility. The success of one Sun artist brought attention to the label and indirectly boosted the profile of the others. Their early personal relationship can therefore be understood as respectful, limited by circumstance, and shaped by shared beginnings rather than deep intimacy. They were peers experiencing rapid transformation. They stood on the same starting line, but sprinted into different lanes. In later decades, when asked about Elvis's character in those formative years, Cash consistently emphasized his politeness and talent, rather than indulging in myths or tabloid narratives. That restraint says much about how he remembered the 1950s. It was not a time of scandal or drama between them. It was a time of growth, experimentation, and breakthrough. Before Las Vegas residencies and health struggles, there were simply two young Southern musicians chasing sound in Memphis. They shared studio space, touring stages, and the uncertainty of a new genre finding its footing. Their bond was not built on daily friendship, but on mutual origin. And in the story of American music, that shared beginning remains one of its most important chapters. The two stars didn't share the same path forever. Soon enough, they had to go their separate ways. And this is how it happened, when stars grow apart. As the 1950s closed, the world around Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley changed quickly. By this time, fame was no longer regional. It was international, relentless, and consuming. As their careers expanded, the space between them widened. After completing his military service in Germany in 1960, Elvis returned to the United States as a polished national icon. Under the management of Colonel Tom Parker, and bound to contracts with RCA Records and major film studios, Presley's career shifted heavily toward Hollywood. Between 1960 and the end of the decade, he made more than 24 films. The soundtracks from those movies dominated his recording schedule. While many of the films were commercially successful, critics later argued that the formula limited his artistic growth. During these years, Elvis's public life became more structured and more insulated. He worked on studio sets, stayed in controlled environments, and traveled with an increasingly tight inner circle. The raw unpredictability of the Sun Records era gave way to careful image management. Though he still recorded powerful material at times, the spontaneity of his early career became harder to see. Johnny Cash, meanwhile, moved in a very different direction.
Well, other songs that weren't quite so popular, that was about life as I knew it.
The early 1960s were difficult for him. His growing addiction to amphetamines led to canceled shows, arrests, and personal strain. Unlike Elvis, whose team worked hard to shield him from public scandal, Cash's struggles were widely reported. His marriage deteriorated. His health suffered. He became increasingly restless. Yet, this same period also marks some of the most creative risks of Cash's life. Rather than lean into safe commercial formulas, he began reconnecting with the darker themes that shaped his songwriting. He recorded songs about prisoners, Native Americans, social injustice, and spiritual doubt. In 1968, his live album recorded at Folsom Prison revitalized his career. The performance was raw, electric, and emotionally direct. It reminded audiences that Cash's strength was his honesty. By the late 1960s, the contrast between their public images was clear. Elvis was performing carefully choreographed shows, first in film and later in major Las Vegas residencies. Cash was building a reputation as a rebel with moral depth. They saw each other less. Even though they worked in the same industry, that was the much that they shared. Cash later acknowledged that they were never extremely close friends, even in earlier years. By this point, their lives were moving in circles that barely overlapped. Elvis's residence at Graceland became increasingly private, guarded by staff and security. Visitors were controlled, access narrowed. Cash, who valued independence and authenticity, did not push to enter that circle. Elvis's schedule in the late 1960s and early 70s centered around Las Vegas engagements and high-profile appearances. His 1968 television special successfully revived his musical credibility, proving he could still command a stage without movie scripts. But even this comeback was orchestrated within a tightly managed framework. Cash's resurgence followed a different pattern. In 1969, he launched The Johnny Cash Show on national television. The program featured a wide range of guests, from Bob Dylan to gospel groups, reflecting Cash's broad musical curiosity. It positioned him not just as a performer, but as a cultural bridge between genres. With this, he became an interpreter of American music. Despite both men returning to strong public visibility at the end of the 1960s, they did not reconnect in any sustained way. There were no joint tours, no collaborative records, no renewed Sun-style jam sessions. The friendship of proximity had faded into respectful distance. The 1970s intensified the separation. Elvis's health began to decline under the strain of prescription substance use, exhaustion, and the pressures of constant touring. His performances remained powerful at times, but reports of inconsistency and physical deterioration grew. Cash, by contrast, moved towards spiritual reflection and personal recovery after marrying June Carter in 1968. His faith deepened. Though he still faced struggles, he publicly embraced redemption narratives. He wrote openly about temptation and grace. His identity became tied not just to music, but to testimony. Cash did not publicly criticize Elvis during these years. He did not speculate about Presley's health or private habits. When asked about him in interviews, Cash tended to emphasize respect rather than gossip. That restraint was notable during a decade when tabloids increasingly fed on celebrity decline. By the time Elvis Presley passed away in 1977, the two men had not shared meaningful public moments for years. So, Cash did not respond with sensational commentary. He framed Presley's life within broader reflections on talent and pressure rather than scandal. That tone would define his later remarks as well. The 1960s and 70s did not erase their shared origins, but they did reshape the relationship into something quieter. The small Memphis studio that once connected them had given way to separate worlds of fame. One lived behind the gates of Graceland and the bright lights of Las Vegas. The other walked into prisons and television studios with equal conviction. This is the part where we reveal what Johnny had to say after years of silence. Stay with us. What Johnny Cash said years after. When Elvis Presley passed away in August 1977, the world mourned. Newspapers rushed to print details. Television anchors replayed old footage. Rumors thrived. In the middle of that storm, many people waited to hear what fellow legends would say. Johnny Cash was one of them. By that time, Cash was no longer just a country singer. He was a senior voice in American music. In interviews across the 1980s and 1990s, Cash consistently described Elvis in human terms. He remembered the young man from the Sun Records days. He spoke about Presley's early clarity and intelligence. According to Cash's own recollections in his autobiography Man in Black and later in Cash, the autobiography, Elvis was not naive about the business. He understood what was happening around him. He knew he was creating something new. Cash resisted the simplified narrative that Elvis had been merely a victim of fame from the beginning. Cash also avoided dramatic claims about their closeness. He was honest that they were not best friends who spoke daily. Their relationship had been built on shared beginnings, touring bills, and professional overlap. That honesty gave credibility to his praise. During decades when Elvis's name was often tied to stories about prescription substance abuse, isolation, and decline, Cash did not publicly dissect those details. This restraint was significant because Cash himself had battled addiction. He understood the pressures of fame and chemical dependency from the inside. Instead of judging, he showed empathy. In multiple interviews, Cash emphasized Elvis's natural musical gift. He described the voice as unique and instinctive. He acknowledged that Presley had a deep connection to gospel music and spiritual themes, something often overshadowed by his rock and roll image. Cash understood that Elvis loved sacred music and felt most at home singing it. That shared gospel foundation remained central in Cash's memory. Cash also recognized the weight Elvis carried as a cultural lightning rod. Presley did not simply sing songs. He disrupted social boundaries in the 1950s by blending rhythm and blues with country. He moved in ways that scandalized older audiences. He became a symbol of youth rebellion before he was old enough to fully grasp its consequences. In later interviews, Cash suggested that this level of fame created isolation. The higher Elvis rose, the fewer people could relate to his daily life. When Cash spoke publicly after Presley's death, he tended to frame Elvis as a man who had given enormous energy to the world. He did not reduce him to his final years. He highlighted the breakthrough moments, the courage to record new sounds, and the charisma that changed live performance forever. He understood that cultural memory can shrink a person into their final chapter. He resisted that. In the 1990s, as Cash entered the final creative revival of his own career through the American Recordings series produced by Rick Rubin, journalists often asked him to reflect on earlier eras of music. Those conversations frequently returned to Elvis. By then, enough time had passed for nostalgia to soften public debate. Cash's tone remained consistent. He did not revise history to create drama. He maintained that Elvis had been talented, kind in their early years, and shaped by forces larger than any one individual. Importantly, Cash never tried to claim ownership of Elvis's story. He did not position himself as a secret confidant with hidden revelations. He did not suggest that he alone understood what went wrong. His later reflections were notable precisely because they avoided that temptation. They felt like the perspective of someone who had shared a starting point, observed from a distance, and chosen respect over spectacle. By the time Cash approached the end of his own life in the early 2000s, his legacy was secure. He had survived addiction, reinvented his sound, and recorded haunting late-career albums that confronted mortality head-on. When asked again about Elvis in those final years, he stayed consistent with the version he had told for years. In doing so, Cash shaped how many listeners would remember Elvis Presley. If you've ever wondered what Johnny's personal opinion of Elvis's demise was, you'll find this interesting. Keep watching for the next part of our video. How Johnny Cash Saw. Elvis Cash's relationship with Christianity stretched back to childhood, but it grew more intense and personal after the chaos of his addiction years in the 1960s. His marriage to June Carter strengthened that foundation. He read the Bible daily. He recorded gospel albums throughout his career. He even wrote a novel about the Apostle Paul. When Elvis Presley passed away in 1977, public conversation quickly turned toward the circumstances of his death. Speculation about prescription medication, isolation, and physical decline filled newspapers and television segments. Many voices treated Presley's final years as a cautionary tale about excess. Cash did not join that chorus. In interviews after Elvis's death, Cash's tone was steady and morally grounded. He avoided judgment. He did not analyze medical details or recount rumors. Instead, he spoke about the burden of fame and the fragility of human beings placed under extreme pressure. Because Cash had faced his own struggles with addiction, he understood how easy it was for public narratives to oversimplify private battles. Cash believed that ultimate judgment belonged to God, not commentators. This belief guided how he framed Presley's life. Rather than reducing Elvis to the circumstances of his death, Cash emphasized the totality of his journey. He acknowledged the extraordinary gifts Presley had been given and the enormous expectations placed upon him at a young age. From Cash's perspective, those two realities were inseparable. Both men shared a deep connection to gospel music. Elvis had recorded several sacred albums, including His Hand in Mine and How Great Thou Art, the latter earning him Grammy recognition in the gospel category. Cash recognized that side of Presley. He understood that Elvis's spiritual interest was genuine, not a marketing strategy.
So I'll tell you one thing I know, that his first love was gospel music.
In fact, those who spent time at Graceland often described late-night gospel singing sessions around the piano. Cash did not dismiss these stories. He saw them as evidence that Presley's faith remained important to him, even amid fame. As Cash aged, his interviews increasingly turned toward themes of mercy and redemption. During the 1990s, particularly after the release of the American Recordings albums produced by Rick Rubin, Cash's public image shifted again. He became a symbol of stark honesty about mortality. Songs like Hurt, recorded near the end of his life, carried the weight of someone confronting regret without denying hope. In that same period, when journalists asked him about Elvis, Cash's spiritual maturity was evident. He did not present Presley as a moral lesson for others. He did not position himself as spiritually superior. Instead, he spoke as one flawed man about another. In several public conversations, Cash suggested that fame creates spiritual danger because it isolates individuals from correction and honest friendship. The higher someone rises, the fewer people speak plainly to them. Cash had felt this himself. He understood how easy it was to drift when surrounded by admiration rather than accountability. By the early 2000s, Cash's health was declining. June Carter. Cash had passed away in 2003, and Johnny followed only months later. In those final interviews, he spoke frequently about eternity, forgiveness, and reunion beyond death. Though he did not deliver a dramatic final statement about Elvis, his lifelong pattern of respect functioned as his lasting word. Cash's moral perspective prevented him from exploiting Presley's story for attention. In an era when posthumous revelations often generate headlines, Cash chose restraint. That restraint was not silence born of secrecy. It was silence shaped by belief. Through that lens, Elvis Presley was not simply the king of rock and roll. He was a man gifted with extraordinary talent, tested by extraordinary pressure, and ultimately accountable to the same divine measure as anyone else. For Johnny Cash, that truth was enough. In memory of Elvis Presley. By the time Johnny Cash entered the final stretch of his life, he had become more than a recording artist. He was a living bridge to the earliest days of rock and roll. When he spoke about Elvis Presley, he was not just recalling an old colleague. He was preserving a chapter of American cultural history. Elvis passed away in 1977 at the age of 42. Johnny Cash lived another 26 years. While Elvis was now to the new generation an icon in documentaries and biographies, men like Johnny became important because they had seen and known Elvis. As media revisited Presley's life again and again, Cash's perspective was priceless. He had known Elvis before the global hysteria. He had seen him when he was still a young artist experimenting at Sun Records. Because of that early connection, Cash's recollections anchored Elvis's story in something real and human. Cash agreed that Elvis was talented. He had earned his title fair and square. He also agreed that Elvis had a great instinct for sound and could jam the most unique genres into new melodies. Cash also contributed to preserving Elvis's gospel identity. Public memory often highlights the jumpsuits, the Las Vegas performances, and the screaming fans. Cash, however, repeatedly mentioned Presley's deep connection to sacred music. By doing so, he reminded audiences that Elvis's musical foundation included church harmonies and spiritual longing. That detail complicated simplified narratives about fame and excess. By the time of Cash's final interviews in 2003, he was old but emotionally clear. June Carter Cash had passed away earlier that year. His own health was failing due to complications from diabetes and other illnesses. He was openly thinking about death. In that season, his reflections on the past were stripped of ambition. They were raw and real. That's why people trusted his side of the story on Elvis Presley. After Johnny Cash passed away in September 2003, public conversation linked the two legends again. Media outlets revisited the $1 Million Quartet session. Documentaries explored the shared Memphis roots. The image of young Elvis and young Johnny standing in the same small studio regained symbolic power. Cash's steady testimony over the years had protected that image from being overshadowed entirely by tragedy. Today, discussions about Elvis Presley often include nuance about management decisions, cultural context, race, and commercialization. They also include acknowledgement of his spiritual interests and musical versatility. While historians and biographers deserve credit for deep research, Cash's long, consistent public respect helped keep those dimensions alive in mainstream memory. In the end, Johnny Cash did not break silence with a scandalous confession before his death. What he offered was truth. Because of that, when modern audiences look back at Elvis Presley, they often see more than the headlines of 1977. They see the spark of Sun Records, the blend of gospel and blues, and the cultural shift that followed. And part of that fuller picture exists because Johnny Cash chose to be honest and let Elvis rest in peace. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.